All right, so welcome to deploying and consuming serverless functions with AWS Amplify. Today I'm going to be going over how to do everything you need to do with a Lambda function using the Amplify framework. My name is Nader Dabbit. You can follow me on Twitter at Dabbit3. I tweet a lot about different serverless stuff, React stuff, and React Native stuff. I work on the team at AWS Mobile as a developer advocate. And what we have within my organization are a couple of different things: AWS Amplify, AWS AppSync, Device Farm, and a couple of other things around mobile development. So we're going to be going over, though, mainly focusing on serverless functions, but the Amplify framework that we're going to be using, you can do a lot more with as well. So to start things off, we'll take a look at the agenda. The agenda today is going to look something like this. We're going to look at the different options for building Lambda functions using different frameworks other than AWS Amplify. We're then going to look at AWS Amplify as a quick overview. We're going to also look at Lambda and kind of get a quick understanding about how Lambda works before we actually start writing some code. Then we're going to go into the demo where we're going to create, update, and remove Lambda functions. We're going to look at how to invoke Lambda functions from a client-side web application. In our case, that's going to be React. We're going to look at how to invoke these functions locally using our terminal and working with a curl command. We're also going to look at how to work with multiple environments and also deleting the project once we're done. So let's go ahead and get started. So when you're working with AWS Lambda, there are a few different options. The first is Serverless Framework that you might have heard of. Serverless Framework is pretty popular and it allows you to do things with Lambda functions, but also work with other cloud providers that aren't AWS. So you can work with Google Cloud Functions, you can work with Azure Functions, and I believe maybe something with Kubernetes. There's also Terraform, SAM, and CloudFormation. Those are all kind of similar because they all use CloudFormation, and they consist of writing boilerplate and kind of understanding a lot of what's going on underneath the hood with Lambda. I would say Serverless Framework, Terraform, SAM, and CloudFormation all require some AWS knowledge, whereas Amplify is pretty easy to get up and running without knowing a whole lot about AWS. So it's kind of geared towards developers that are typically not familiar with AWS. But it's also really nice for anyone looking to deploy Lambda functions because it allows you to do everything from a CLI. And you don't have to write a lot of boilerplate. You just have to write your function code and deploy your app, and that's about it. We package up the Lambda function, the node modules, and deploy it. We even put an API in front of it. You can also go directly in the AWS console and create Lambda functions. And then finally, you can use other third-party providers like Claudia and Apex. These are pretty good, depending, if you like the way that they do things. So I would suggest, if you're interested in Lambda functions, just taking a brief look at these other options after you look at AWS Amplify, kind of figure out which one works best for you. I'm a big fan of Amplify, but I'm a little biased. So we'll look at what Amplify is. We're not going to go over too many more slides. This is mainly code heavy, but we're going to look at a few more slides around what Amplify is. Right now, Amplify consists of three main parts. There's the CLI, the command line interface, which allows you to create, update, and delete cloud services. There's the client libraries. So we have native libraries for native iOS and Android, and we also have JavaScript libraries for React, React Native, any JavaScript framework actually. And then we also have framework-specific support for specific libraries to add on to the base functionality. Then we have the Amplify console, which is a way to deploy your app, have hosting and things like that. And then we have pre-built UI components. And the pre-built UI components kind of work along with the JS framework support. And then we have what we call the tool chain. It does a lot of code generation. So it allows you to kind of do things like introspect a GraphQL schema and generate local code for all of the GraphQL operations. And also we have a way to generate function code for your Lambda functions, which we'll look at. The client SDK is a little different than the AWS JavaScript SDK. It's more opinionated, it's more declarative, it's heavily focused on the client, so you probably wouldn't use Amplify on the server. You're only going to be using Amplify on the client. We have it with best practices baked in, and we have it built with the Amplify CLI in mind, and you'll see that especially when we're working with Lambda functions. The API is very opinionated when it comes to working with Lambda functions especially. And we have abstractions built with the Amplify CLI in mind. So with the CLI, you can create, update, and delete cloud services. You can manage multiple environments. And I talked about the GraphQL and the Lambda code generation. The categories that the CLI supports right now are authentication, analytics, interactions. You can actually see all of them here. The main ones that people seem to be, we have use of all of them, of course, but the most popular are API, GraphQL and REST, serverless functions, storage, and authentication. A lot of these categories combine multiple services, services that you don't have to kind of know really how they understand how they work. So, for instance, when you use API category with REST, it will actually use something called API Gateway, which essentially just creates a URL that allows you to send HTTP requests, and that HTTP request gets forwarded to your Lambda function. So some of these categories are made up of multiple services, but under the hood, you don't really have to worry about how that works. So working with the CLI, the workflow looks something like this. If you want a new service, you run Amplify add service name. If you want to deploy a service that you've created using Amplify add, you run Amplify push. This deploys everything to your backend. If you want to change something, you run Amplify configure and the name of the thing you'd like to change. If you want to remove a single service, Amplify remove. And if you want to delete the entire project, it's Amplify delete. Working with multiple environments is a feature that we added recently that was very, very important for a lot of developers, and it's super helpful and powerful. It allows you to kind of take an existing base environment and clone it into a new environment. So say, for instance, you have a serverless function, an authentication service, and a GraphQL API, and you want to add a new feature to that GraphQL API without affecting anything else. We'll actually deploy an entirely new infrastructure by creating a new environment. So we'll have a new authentication service, a new GraphQL API, a new Lambda function. Will allow you to make changes in your dev environment and merge over only the changes that you want to keep in your main environment after testing out that new feature. So to do that, to work with multiple environments, we have this env command on the command line on the CLI. So you can run amplify env, and then we have a bunch of different things that you can do from amplify env. So amplify env add, amplify env list, amplify env checkout, and remove. If we have time, we'll kind of go over those later. And then the client is what you work with on the JavaScript side or the mobile side if you're working with native. This is what you do after you create your service. Use the client to interact with the service. So when you're working with the Amplify client, you just install it via npm, or if you're using native, we're kind of working with JavaScript in this tutorial and this screencast. But yeah, you could install this either native iOS, native Android, or with JavaScript. Once you've installed the library, you have these different categories or this different classes that you can import. So for instance, here we have auth, API, storage. So you just import these classes and then you can use those something like this. So this is kind of how it would look when we're working with the API gateway with the Lambda function. We import the API, we call API.get or API.post or put or delete. We pass in the name of the API. So this is like referencing the endpoint. So we don't have to like type in HTTPS, some really long URL, and then the path that we want to hit. We have native support again for native iOS and Android, and framework specific support on the JavaScript side for Ionic, Angular, Vue, React, and React Native. But with any JavaScript library, this fully works. We just have additional features for these frameworks. So let's take a look at a quick demo or a quick overview in code how this looks, deploying a Lambda function with API Gateway using AWS Amplify CLI. So I mentioned earlier that the Lambda function is event-based. So when you're invoking a Lambda function, we want to decide which event we want to trigger this Lambda function. For our example, we want to trigger this Lambda function via an HTTP endpoint. So that means we need not only the function, but also the HTTP endpoint or the API URL. So we have to add two things to get this to work. We need to add a function. So we'll run amplify add function. And we want to then run amplify add API to create the actual HTTP endpoint. After we've created the API, we can then update the code for the Lambda function. So we might have a .get, .post, .put, different endpoints like that that we want to work with. So for instance, we have this app.get with a path of /items. This is where our Lambda function code would go. And then once we're done and we're happy creating our Lambda function to deploy it, we can run amplify push. This deploys our Lambda function to our backend. And then when we want to make changes, we can then go back in and change our code and run amplify push again. This will bundle up our Lambda function and deploy it. So to interact with the API, once we've deployed it, we can import the API category from AWS Amplify. And then we can call API.get, passing in the path. And this will return a promise. So we can either do async awaits, or we can say .then.catch. So let's take a two-slide overview look at what Lambda is. So AWS Lambda is categorized, I guess you could say, as functions as a service. So there's other providers like Azure and Google Cloud Functions that are in a similar space. But they essentially allow you to run code without provisioning or managing any servers. So that's why they call it serverless. The servers are still there, just like wireless telephones still have wires working somewhere. Once your network reaches a certain point, there's wires, right? But you don't have to deal with those. So that's why we call it wireless. Just like with serverless, you're not dealing with servers, but the servers are still there. You just don't have to deal with managing, updating, patching, any of that stuff. They scale automatically for you. So if you get 1 million users or 100 million users, I guess, which hopefully will happen for you, everything will just continue to work and nothing will break. And that's one of the huge selling points. Also, you're paying only for the compute time that you consume. So you're not paying for all of the infrastructure until people are using it. So at that point, you're only paying for compute time versus compute resources. Lambda functions are event-based. So not only can you trigger a Lambda from an HTTP event, but also from other Lambda functions using the AWS SDK or from AWS services. So say, for instance, you upload an image to S3 and you want to do some transformations to that image, you can trigger a Lambda function that will pass that image to a Lambda function. There you can do things like change the size of the image or create multiple sizes and then store that back into S3. You might trigger a DynamoDB. After you update or upload something to DynamoDB, you might trigger a Lambda function to do something after that happens. So Cognito is a popular use case. So you sign up a user. Maybe you want to assign that user to a group. You can do that in a Lambda function, and there is a way to set up a trigger pretty easily. So the Lambda triggers are pretty powerful. Triggers that go to Lambda. Lambda function typically has a file name and a handler function, and then this function will be referenced as the name of the file dot handler or dot whatever you want that function invocation to be. So here we have a function called hello world, and we have an exports.handler function. The handler is what takes the events and then returns whatever you'd like to return. So in this case, we are looking at an exports.handler that has two arguments passed in, an event and a context. This is the same event and context that you'll see in every Lambda function. The event has all of the information passed into the function. So if this was an S3 upload, this might have the image URL and other metadata about the image. If we're sending a post request to this Lambda function from an HTTP endpoint, this event would hold the event body, the headers, all of that stuff. The context tells you things about the invocation. So you would have information about the invocation in the context. And then when you're done with whatever work that you're doing in the Lambda function, you'll just return an object with the status code of 200 and whatever else things that you'd like to return. Here we're returning that object with a status code and a body. You can also do things a lot more than this, of course. This is a pretty simple example. So that's the end of the slides. Let's go ahead and take a look at a demo. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and open my terminal, and we're going to start off by creating a new React application. So I'm going to use create React app, and I'll call this SLS app for serverless app. I'm using npx. This is very similar to create React app installed globally, except we don't have to worry about installing create React app globally. Yeah, typically you'll create your Lambda function inside, your Amplify project inside of a base project that's a client-side project. So this could have been a Vue app or a React Native app. It could have also been a native iOS app or native Android app. It could also have just been an index.js with a package.json, so plain old JavaScript app. Whatever project you want to create, you then change into the directory, and then from here, this is where we'll initialize the Amplify project. So to create the project, we run amplify init. This will create the base project for what we're going to do next. Here, we're going to be walked through a few different steps. So the name of the project, the name for the environment, I'll call this dev. This is our base environment for future multiple environments if we like. The text editor I'd like to use, and then I'm going to kind of take the defaults because it knows what kind of app we're in. It knows we're in a React app, so it's going to choose JavaScript, React, and all of this other stuff. Now for the AWS profile, I'm going to go ahead and just choose a profile. To set up a profile, if you don't already have one, you can run Amplify configure, and we have a couple of videos on how all of that works on the Amplify docs. And while that's creating, let's go ahead and take a look at the Amplify documentation. And if you want to learn more about what we're doing here, you can go to docs, JavaScript, and look for API. And this will kind of walk through some of the stuff that we're going to be going over. And then also, I would encourage you to check out the Amplify community. The Amplify community is a site that we just launched a week or two ago. And this has community resources, upcoming events. A lot of these events are free. Some of them are not. But for instance, you see the serverless functions in depth. That is what I'm doing now. We also have a lot of posts. So you can go to posts and filter based on different categories, and you can also see platforms as well. So after the Amplify project has been created, we can now run Amplify status, and this is going to be where we can start seeing services as they're added. So right now we don't have any services added. If we do, they will be shown in this category. We can also run ls and ls-src and see that the Amplify init created an Amplify folder and an AWS-exports file in the source directory. Both of these folder and file will be kind of kept up for us by the CLI. We might be going into Amplify folder later. In fact, we will, and making some changes in the backend directory. The backend directory is what's going to hold any custom code that we're going to write. So this is going to hold our Lambda function code. And then there's the current cloud backend folder. This is not anything that we ever need to touch. This is what is currently deployed to our backend. So the flow would look something like this. We make a change in our backend folder. We run Amplify push. After the push is complete, this syncs with our backend. So we kind of have a local copy of what has been deployed. So to add the first function, I'm going to go ahead and run Amplify add function. And this is going to go ahead and create our first function. So we need to give a function name. This will be people function because, well, actually that's kind of too specified. We're going to be doing other things. So let's call this main lambda. And the main lambda function, we have three options. And this is kind of some of that code generation that I was talking about earlier. We can generate some boilerplate code for you to start you off. The hello world function will be something like that exports.handler we looked at earlier. We can also create a CRUD function with all of the different CRUD operations that you might see against a NoSQL database. And then we have the option for a serverless express function. This one is what we're going to be using because it allows us to run an express app in our Lambda function, which essentially gives us access to these endpoints like /get, /put, /update, /delete. So when we do pass in a path, it will proxy that path through API gateway, and we'll be able to kind of hit different paths. Whereas if we just have this hello world function, it would just invoke that one function every time. So serverless express will build all that for us. We will edit the local function now by choosing yes. And this should go ahead and open this up in our text editor of choice. And I'll close this other code that I'm not using. And we'll focus right here. So this is the code that we're going to be working with. But let's kind of look at the entire project, actually. That might make more sense than just looking at this one file. So I'm going to go ahead and open up this entire project in my text editor. And from here, we can kind of see a little bit more context of where that code is going to live. And let me try quitting Visual Studio Code and opening it right back up. So this is our React app. We have this Amplify folder over here, and we have this backend folder, and now we have a new function folder that's going to hold all of our functions. Right now, we only have one main Lambda function. So in that main Lambda function, we have our src directory. So the source directory, this is where all our code lives. So this is just like a basic, JavaScript application that you might have written in the past, where we have an index.js, a package.json with dependencies. The index.js is that exports.handler. So this is going to be our main entry point. What we're doing, instead of just writing our code here, is we're proxying this event into an Express server that's running in app.js. So this is where all of our code is going to really live, in this app.js file. So I'm going to delete some of this comments and kind of walk you through the very bottom of this. So if you've ever written an Express app, you know that to start an Express server, you create an app instance, and then you call app.listen with the number of the port. So that's kind of what's going on here. And what we have is we've enabled cores, we've enabled body parser so we can work with forms and stuff. And then we have these different endpoints where we're calling the different HTTP verbs like get, put, post, delete, and so on. So the first function that the first API we want to create is a people API. This is going to fetch a list of people and kind of return it back to us. So what I did is I copied this and just put it here, and I'm going to create a new endpoint called people. And what I want to do is create an array called people and set this to have a name property, and that's about it for now. So we have 2 people in our people array. We want to be able to invoke this function and return this data, and we're going to get, of course, more complex than this. This is just kind of to get us started to see what's going on. So what we'll do is we have this new endpoint /people. We'll create a people array, and then we'll respond with the people array. So you'll notice that we have a request and a response that we can work with. To return from this function any data, we're going to call a response.json and pass in whatever we'd like to return. In this case, we're returning an object that has success, URL, and people. And then we also have this request object. And I mentioned earlier that the request has, the Lambda function has an event and a context. Both of those are available on the request. So the way we can get that is by saying request.api gateway.event or request.api gateway.context. And let me make sure that that's, okay, so the G needs to be uppercase actually, so it's API gateway like that. But yeah, so the request event is still available, the context is still available, and we also have this request.body that's available. So if we do any post or put or any of those update operations, we'll also have the request body. On the get, we will not have the request body. So just to kind of let you know what's going on there, because we're going to be using some of that stuff in just a moment. But now that we've created /people, let's go ahead and save that and go back to our Amplify command line project and hit enter. And it looks like it says, okay, it looks like we've successfully added our Lambda function. So the next step is do whatever we'd like to do. So what we want to do is we want to add an API in front of this. So we want to say amplify add API. We have the Lambda function. Now we want to be able to invoke it with an actual API. So this is going to create like a URL for us to invoke it with. So the type of API we want is REST. For the name of the API, let's call this main app API. For the path, we created a /people path. So this is the path that we want to configure first. And we can choose to create a new Lambda function or use the Lambda function we already added. And that's the choice we're going to choose, the Lambda function we already created. We'll then be prompted with a list of functions that we would like to choose. We only have one function, so I'm going to choose that one function. For the API access, I'm going to choose not to restrict this. This will allow you, if you did want to do this, to add authentication in front of your API. So what we're going to do in just a moment is we're going to add authentication. We're going to create a new path, and then we're going to restrict the access to that path and show how one path works and the other path doesn't. Next, it's asking us if we'd like to add another path. I'm going to choose no. So now we've created our API and our function, and if we run amplify status, we should see that we have two categories now available to us. So we have the function and the API, and then the operation is set to create. The operation is what you see if, basically it specifies what's going to happen the next time you run amplify push. So we have amplify status, we have the operation of create and create for function and Lambda. I'm sorry, function and API. So now if we run amplify push, it's going to go ahead and update these two operations. So are we sure we want to continue? We can choose yes, and this is going to go ahead and deploy our API and our Lambda function. So this is going to do that deployment. Depending on how long this takes, it could be like a minute or two. So while that's happening, I'm going to go back to the main React app, and we're going to go ahead and update our React app to go ahead and start working with this Lambda function, because once it's deployed, we want to be able to start interacting with it. So in our source directory, we have app.js and index.js. So app.js is the main entry point to our React app. I'm sorry, index.js is the main entry point, and app.js is going to be where we're writing most of our code. So in index.js, we need to create a way to let this React application know that we're working with Amplify. So we basically need to configure it. And the way that we do that is we configure this at the root level, and we run amplify.configure, and then we pass in that AWS exports file that I talked about earlier. So that means we need to go ahead and import Amplify from AWS Amplify. We need to go ahead and import the config from the AWS-exports file that we had created by the command line. And then we can just call amplify.configure, passing in the config. Boom, we just do that once, that's it. We only have to configure our app at the root level at the very beginning, and after that, we're kind of done. So now that we've created and configured our configuration here, let's go ahead and close index.js, and the only thing that we're going to need to be working with is our app.js file. So in app.js, I'm going to go ahead and import a couple of things, and I might go ahead and remove a couple of things because really, let's go ahead and get rid of some of this code so we don't have so much code on our screen. So what I want to work with is the API category. So I'm going to go ahead and import API from AWS Amplify. Next, I need to have a way to invoke the function that we created. So I'm going to have a function that I'll actually set here. That's called call API. And I'll need to make sure that we put the name function in front of that. And we might even call this async function because we want to do an asynchronous operation, and we might do async await. So in order to do, well, I guess we could just call this, but in a moment we're going to need to update some state. So since we're working with the functional component in React, we can now use these use effect and use state hooks. And we're going to be working probably with use effect, where we can then call a function when this component loads. So the function we'll be calling is call API. And to only call this once, we're going to pass in an empty array. That way this that only gets invoked once. And in call API, we'll do a try catch block. And this is going to be where we call the API and hit the endpoint. So once this Lambda function and API is created, you should see this message, all resources are updated in the cloud. So once that's done, we can go ahead and test this out. So what I'm going to do is call api.get, and here we need to pass in the name and the path. We're also going to say store this in a variable, and I'll call this people data, and I'll set this to await api.get. And the API name is going to be in our Amplify folder under backend API and the name of the API that we set earlier. If you remember right, we did main app API. And the endpoint that we want to work with is /people. So we could just say /people, and this will return some data, and we can just go ahead and console.log this data. So once we have the data logged out, we can kind of just see what that data is looking like. And if there's an error, I'll go ahead and log out the error. Okay, so all of this looks good. So the app will load, call API will happen, we'll log out the data, and then later on, we can worry about rendering the data. Okay, so to start this up, we'll go ahead and open up another window and just run npm start. And while that's running, I'm going to step away for 1 second and grab a Kleenex. All right, so our app looks like it is loading at localhost 3000. And I think we might have forgotten one step. We have not installed AWS Amplify. So let's go back to our root of our project and just say yarn add AWS Amplify, AWS Amplify React. And we can also do this using npm install. So we'll go back to Chrome, and after this is installed, it should reload and we should see everything working properly. And we'll go ahead and open our inspector so we can kind of take a look at the stuff that's returned from the console here. I don't see anything logged out. Let me make sure. Okay, there we go. So when we refresh, we see that we have this people data array, and we have 2 items in the array, one for Nader and one for Jennifer. So it looks like our React app is working. Let's kind of take a quick look at how to render some of this state to our screen. We're going to go ahead and create a variable called people and update people, and we'll set this to use state, passing in an empty array. So this will basically create a new variable called people that's going to be set to an empty array, and we'll give us a function called update people to update that array. So starting off, people will be an empty array, so we can just say people.map person index, and what we'll do is we'll just return h2 with the person's name, so p.name. All right, so once the data comes back from the API, we can just say update people, passing in the people data dot people, I think. Yeah, people data dot people. So let's save that and refresh. And now we see that we have the name and all that stuff rendered. So now that we have a basic app working, let's go ahead and think about how we can make this a little better. So typically what you'll be doing in these Lambda functions is working with other APIs. So you're going to be calling different APIs, doing asynchronous stuff is really the main thing I'm getting at. So how can we async call another API and return some data in our Lambda function? So to do that, we're going to need a library to work with HTTP requests. I'm a big fan of Axios, so let's go ahead and install Axios in our Lambda function. And to do that, we're going to go in Amplify backend folder. So we're going to say Amplify backend, function, main, app, Lambda, and source directory. So in the source directory is where we have our package.json, our index.js, our node modules, and everything. So I'm just going to say yarn add Axios, and this is going to go ahead and install Axios. So after we've installed Axios and our Lambda function, we'll just go back to our main project, and we'll go ahead and open up the app.js that's in our Lambda function right here. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and import Axios. And what we want to do is call the Star Wars API and hit the people endpoint. And this is going to like return some information. Or actually, yeah, let's find the Star Wars API. And we're going to go to documentation, and we'll just kind of copy this endpoint. And endpoint we want is people. Okay, so we're going to copy this URL. Well, we can just pass this in, hard coding it. And instead of hard coding all this stuff, let's go ahead and make a call to axios.get, passing in this URL. And then we'll say .catch. And what we're going to do is still do response.json, except we're going to have a little bit different for the people. We're going to have to specify something off of the response. And in catch, we'll just, we'll actually still do response.json, and we'll just say error true. That way we can catch the error on the client. So let me double check and see what the data structure is looking like for the Star Wars API. So this is going to have a data, so response.data, and then it's going to have, this data is basically an object, and the results array is what we're interested in. So we're going to just set people to response.data.results and go ahead and save that. And now our updated /people endpoint is going to fetch data from our Star Wars API. So to push this up, we'll run amplify push, and we should see an update now to our Lambda function. So our function category should have an update associated with it, which it does. So that's good. And now we can just choose yes to go ahead and continue. All right, so we'll wait just one more second and see that this is working. And while that's working, let's think about the next endpoint that we want to add. We can add a cryptocurrency API, and what we want to do that's a little different with this one is we want to show how we can add another endpoint, and then we want to show how we can add authentication in front of this endpoint, because we only want people that are signed in to be able to hit this particular endpoint. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to our command line, and we're going to say amplify configure API. We're going to then set up a new path of something like /coins or something like that. And within our app.js, the one we just used Axios in earlier, we're going to make a new API call and return some data there. But to do that, to add authentication in front of this endpoint, we first need to add authentication to our project. So we're going to be doing that using the with authenticator higher order component. And if you go to docs and you go to authentication, you can kind of get a quick overview of this with authenticator under using the with authenticator. So this is kind of what we're going to be using to add authentication. Okay, so it looks like our app updated, and we should now be able to go back and do a refresh. Looks like we have some type of error, so let me go and see if there's anything that I messed up here. Look at app.js. No, it looks good. Let me try to save this and refresh and just see if I can figure out the network error. We're getting a CORS error, but I think that's just some error I probably made here. Well, now that looks right. I can't use import. That's the problem. I need to say var Axios is because I'm using this require.js versus. So let me do say for Axios is equal to require Axios. And unfortunately, we have to now run amplify push again and go ahead and wait for this to work. So this is basically just updating that Lambda function to go from saying import Axios to requiring Axios. So usually updating the Lambda function will take anywhere around 30 seconds to 1 minute. So we're done now. So now we should be able to go ahead and refresh, and this should work. So we have the people data, we have the people array with the Star Wars stuff. So that's cool. This is a completely unauthenticated API. So let's now add authentication and then add a new Lambda function API call that will require authentication. And we'll hit both of them logged in, and then we'll hit both of them logged out and kind of see how that works. So the crypto API endpoint that we'll kind of hit is this coinlore.com/API/tickers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into app.js and I'm going to say app.get, and I'll say /coins, and this will be a function. And what we're going to say is axios.get, and we're going to call this, and what we're going to do is just do the same thing that we did before, .then response, and what we want to return here instead is coins. So the coins will be the response.data.data, because if we look at the coin lore API response, we have an object that has a data property, and if we go all the way to the bottom, we'll see that it also has an info property. So we don't really want that info. All we want is the array of coins. So the data that we're worried about basically is this array here. So that's why we're saying response.data.data, because the response.data is just the response from Axios. And if there's an error, we'll just return an error. So we added the new /coins endpoint. Now we need to configure the API to recognize that new endpoint. So we can say amplify configure API. And we can choose REST, main app API. We want to add another path, /coins. We want to use the Lambda function already in our project, and we can choose that Lambda function here. We do not want to restrict API access yet, but we're going to add authentication next, and then we're going to update this configuration. Do we want to add another path? No. So we've successfully updated that path. Now let's go ahead and add authentication. So I'm going to run amplify add auth, and this is going to walk us through adding authentication. So the authentication mechanism or configuration I want to use is the default configuration. This is multi-factor auth on sign up, and email and password, or username and password, or a combination of two on sign in. So what do we want the user to use to sign in? I'm going to choose username and password. And then what attributes do we like to require for when they do sign up? We can choose any attributes we like. I'm just going to choose the default of email. So now that we've added authentication, we can go back and actually update our API endpoint to use authentication. So I can say amplify update API, and now we can change the endpoint, that coins endpoint. I'm going to choose update path, and I'm going to choose /coins. And I'm going to keep the same path, but what I want to do is restrict API access. So I'm going to choose yes here. I'm going to only allow people that are signed in to do these operations. So we'll allow create, update, delete, and read. And now people that are signed in can read and update and all this stuff, but people that are not signed in cannot. So let's go ahead and test this out by running amplify push. And this is going to do a bunch of different things. We're creating this new authentication endpoint. We're updating the Lambda function with the new coins endpoint. And we're updating the API with the new coins endpoint. So I'm going to choose yes to continue. This is going to deploy. While that's happening, let's open app.js and go ahead and add authentication in our client. So we've imported API from AWS Amplify. Now let's go ahead and import that with authenticator higher order component from AWS Amplify React. So this is a framework specific component. We have something like this for React Native, Vue, and native iOS and native Android as well, and Angular. This basically will allow us to add not entire authentication flow in front of any component. So we'll be able to put sign up, sign in, forgot password, all that usual stuff. And what we want to do is put this in front of the app component. So I'll go ahead and minimize that. And all we need to do is export the with authenticator as opposed to exporting the main app class. So now I should go ahead and save that. And we want to update our call API endpoint, or this function, to now call the coins API. So what we can do for right now, we're not going to worry about rendering the coins to our UI because the thing that we did earlier will be exactly the same. We'll create some state called coins. We'll create a function to update it in the state, and we'll call it right after the API response comes back. So we would do something just like this. But instead, let's just call the API and log out the data to make sure everything's working. So I can just copy this, and I'll call this coin data. And the endpoint that I want to use is /coins. Okay. And then I just want to console.log the coin data. So when we first load this app, what should happen is this API call should be successful because we're not requiring authentication for this endpoint, and this one should fail. And then we'll sign up and sign back in and sign in, and then both of these should work if everything is created properly. So I'm going to go ahead and save that and go back here. And oh, you know what? I have that with authenticator. I'm going to go ahead and remove that for now. For now, let's just go ahead and work without that. So once this is done being created, we'll test that out again. All right, so the resources were updated properly. So let's test this out by just refreshing. And the first API call should work. The second API call should fail. So we're getting a network error. It looks like a 403 error, so that makes sense. Or 400 error, actually. Actually, I'm not sure which. I see a couple of different errors. Excuse me. But basically, it didn't work. and it didn't work because it's an authenticated endpoint, and we have to be signed in. So let's go ahead and change this to be the with authenticator. And we'll see that we have an authentication flow set up now. So let's go ahead and create an account. And after the account's created, we'll sign in. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my email, get my verification code, and paste that here. All right, so we've signed up. I'm going to go ahead and sign in using that same username. And if everything is working properly, both of the API calls should work because our authenticated endpoint is now interacting with an authenticated user. So now we see the people data and the coin data come back. So we see that we have this array of coins, so we could do whatever we want with this. We could make some type of crypto app. We have our coin data coming back. So now that we have tested out both authenticated and unauthenticated access, and we've looked at how to create and we've looked at how to add endpoints, let's look at how to work with multiple environments. This is going to be kind of the last step of this episode. And to do that, I'm going to go ahead and show you the Amplify env command. Amplify env will be how you handle multiple environments. So right now, we want to go ahead and list out all of the environments. And if you remember when we created the project, we were prompted for an environment name. That's the only environment we have right now. So let's go ahead and create an env, and I'm going to call this feature like 1 or something like that, because we want to create a new environment to add a new feature, and then we want to like test that out without affecting our main environment. Do do I want to use an existing environment? I'm going to go ahead and choose yes. And I'm going to, you know what? I do not want to do that. I want to choose no. So I'm going to start back over, amplify env add feature 1, no to existing environments. The name for the environments, actually, you know what? Maybe I don't need to add the name of the feature. So let's do amplify env add. I may have added the feature 1 name too early. So no to existing environment, name for the environment, feature 1. Looks like we can't use integers. So do we want to use an AWS profile? Very similar to when we created our initial app, we're using another profile. And you could deploy this environment in whatever region you'd like, basically. So I'm just going to use the same environment that I chose, or the same user that I chose in the initial environment. So this is going to go ahead and spin up a copy of our initial environment. So if you remember, we have 3 services set up. We have authentication, we have an API gateway with an endpoint that we're using to hit our Lambda function, and we have a Lambda function. So this is going to basically copy all of that stuff and create a new version of that. And the way it's going to be named, it's going to be kind of named slash feature, slash environment name, which in our case is feature 1. So we'll have the name of our Lambda function slash feature 1, the name of our, authentication cognito service dash feature 1, and so on and so forth. Kind of that's how you can kind of keep up with the differences. So now that we've created that new environment, we can run amplify env list, and we see now we should have 2 environments, and we should be now on the new environment. So you see that we're now on feature 1. So let's configure our API to add a new endpoint. So let's say amplify, let's see here, API configure, and let's add a new API for the GitHub Jobs API that I was checking out earlier. So we'll go to REST, main API. I'll add another path. This is going to be /jobs. I will use a Lambda function we've already created, the main Lambda. To restrict API access or not, I'll go ahead and just choose no for now, and no for adding another path. So we've added a new /jobs endpoint. Let's go ahead and write the code for that. So I'll go to this GitHub Jobs API, and I'll go ahead and do a quick copy and paste of something like React. All right. So we have the endpoint that we want. We have the URL that we want to work with that endpoint. So now we can say app.get, again, /jobs function. And then we can just kind of, let's reference this URL by doing very similar stuff to what we did before, where we just say, pass in that. The response.data is what we need since the array comes back directly, and we'll call this jobs. So we're passing in the new GitHub Jobs API with a search. And what might be interesting, actually, well, we haven't looked at this yet, but how to add post requests. So maybe to show how we can do that, we can call this post. And instead of having the search set to React, we can say we can set a variable and set the search to the request.body.search or something like that. So let's create, instead of using this URL like this, let's use a query string, and we'll just create a variable called search and set that to the request.body.search. Okay, and for the search variable, we'll just do something like search. So we have GitHub Jobs /positions .json search for the query string. And there's actually an easier way even to do query parameters. You can look at the docs to see that. But for this example, I want to show off the request body. So well, we're going to just do a post, I guess. So we're going to search for whatever we passed in as the request.body.search. And if there's no request.body.search, we'll set that to React or something like that. And if there is, then we'll set it to the request.body.search. This way, if no one passes something in, we can just set it just to React. And if they do pass something in, we'll set it to whatever they passed in. So this way, every call should work. All right, so let's try this out. So I'll go ahead and amplify push to go ahead and push this up. Do I want to continue? Yes. While that's doing its thing, let's go ahead and do something a little fancy where we can like have a text input that will call the API every time it changes. So what I'm going to do is set the search string update search string to use state and set the initial search string to an empty string. Okay. We'll have in our app, we'll have like an input, and on change, we will have the event, and we'll call update search string, passing in the event dot body, I guess event dot target dot. Man, mine is going blank right now. Let me just double check that that's right. It's probably not. Event.target.value. Yeah, I don't know. I think I've been using the word body too much. Okay, so we're going to update the search string as the user types, and then we'll have a button that that will call the search, and then on click will be, we'll just call this search function that we haven't created yet. And to call the function, we'll go ahead and call this function. And what we can do is we can say, call this an async function, since we're going to be calling that asynchronous API. And we'll do a try catch. Am I missing something right here? I think I am. There we go. Okay, so try catch. For the try, we'll call API.post, and we're going to pass in the endpoint, which is /jobs. Actually, the endpoint is going to be the main app API. The URL is going to be /jobs, and then we're going to pass in the body, and the search is going to be set to the search string. Okay. So looks like I have something going on here. Okay, it looks like I just need to set that to a variable. So I'll call this like search data, and now let's kind of render that search data, I guess. So I'm going to go ahead and create another piece of state to hold our search data. So I'll call this search data, and I'll call this update search data to use state, and I think this will just be an empty array. Yeah. Okay, cool. So when someone types, we're going to call the Lambda function, passing in the search string, and we should get a response back. For now, let's not update that. Let's just log it out to just make sure this is all working properly. Okay, so I'll go ahead and save that and refresh and see if we have some stuff working. And I'm going to get rid of, let's just get rid of this other call to the coin API for now, and let's even get rid of this other call. Let's not get rid of this whole call API call. Let's not worry about that now. Instead, what we want to work on is just working with the search data. So let's call search data.map, and we'll look at the jobs data, and we'll call we'll just return the title, description, and stuff like that. So we'll map over that. And this will be a job. So we'll use the letter J. J.name or title. And maybe the job.description. And then we'll just set this to a paragraph. So yeah, title and description, that's cool. Let's go ahead and save this and go ahead and refresh. Call API. I'm calling that API call that we don't have anymore, so I'll delete that. And I need to get rid of this with authenticator. So I'll go ahead and change that. All right, so let's go ahead and click search and see what happens. Oh, it looks like I forgot to put await in front of that. So let's try this again. Looks like I should have not used /main-app API. So a lot of mistakes kind of like writing this so fast. All right, so looks like we have some type of error. Let's see if I can figure out. Okay, no error, it actually worked. So we have our jobs data. It looks like it just took a while to come back. So we didn't pass in anything, so it's automatically gonna search for React. So let's look at the description and map over that job description. So to do that, let's go ahead and call update search data. Passing in the search data.jobs. So let's search. And we see that we have a pretty ugly user interface now. Oh, it looks like that that data is coming back already formatted. So what we probably want to do is use the dangerously set inner HTML and see if we can get that to work actually. I don't remember how to do this because it's been a hot minute. So I think it's something like this. So let's set the description as something cool like that. All right, let's try that again. Search. Ooh, it looks like something happened. Wonder why that. Let me just get rid of this div right now. Let's just show the title. All right, so I'm not too worried about this rendering the jobs description. It should be working, so I'm not sure what's going on with that. Unless the dangerously set inner HTML API like change or something. So it looks like I need to do something like that. So let's just try this one more time to see if we can get it working. So I'm going to create a function called create markup. That's going to pass in the j.description. And create markup is going to be this function that takes up some markup and returns an object like that. And let's try that. Nope, still something going on with that that data. So create markup. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure, but I'm not too worried about that. What I really was kind of hoping just to do is like get that. So let's go ahead and try typing in some text and like have maybe this, see if this search actually works. So I don't know if we're going to be able to tell too much on the title, but we see senior full stack React. Let's try adding like Vue and see if anything different comes back. It doesn't look like anything different came back. It looks like the same stuff came back. So there's probably something going on with the way that we're passing in this search string, but I don't really have, I don't think we should spend too much time on it, but yeah, you could debug and figure out what's going on, but apparently something going on with this logic or maybe something going on here. But yeah, that's kind of it. So now that we've created this update, let's say that we're happy with it, even though we're like probably not. Let's say env checkout, and we're going to check out the dev environment. That's kind of like our main environment. So now we can run Amplify status, and we're going to see that we have now a couple of changes in our main environment. We have changes to our function and our API because we've added a new function code and a new API endpoint. So now if we want to merge those changes, we can run Amplify push. And if we want to delete those changes, we can actually run env remove, and we can, let me just run Amplify env list first to see which environments are there. And then we can run Amplify env remove feature. So this is kind of saying we don't want that new feature. We're just going to go ahead and remove that. But if we did want to keep it, we would have run Amplify push and then deleted the environment. That way we would keep the changes. This way we're basically kind of discarding those changes. All right, so now after we've removed that other environment, we should be able to run Amplify status. And if we ran Amplify env list, we'll notice that we only have one environment left. So we removed our other environment, and we're kind of good to go now. So that's kind of it. So if you want to delete the project, you can run Amplify delete, and this will go ahead and delete the project, and this will delete everything associated with it, so all the backend resources. And if you want to check out the code for all this stuff, you can go to GitHub and go to my GitHub repo at Dabbit3. And under repositories, I have a repo set up with serverless functions Twitch. And this has, in the source directory, I have this app Lambda. That kind of shows how we wrote some of that Lambda code. So this is kind of the file that you'd probably be interested in. You also might be interested in source/app.js, where we used React hooks to interact with that Lambda function. And this video is being recorded, and actually this is my second time going through this today. This is my second recording. My first one, I made a couple of mistakes that I wasn't happy with, so I wanted to go back and redo this. So basically, this is going to be uploaded to my YouTube channel. My YouTube is Natter, actually YouTube/C/NatterDabbit. So I'll be updating this, so if you want to come back and check it out, it'll be here. And if you want to subscribe, that's me right there. So that's it. Thank you for watching. I'm going to go ahead and log off. I might leave my Twitch stream on for a little bit. I'm trying to rack up some hours to actually become a affiliate. So I might just kind of leave my office in here, and you're welcome to hang around and ask me any questions or whatever in a few minutes when I come back. But yeah, thank you for watching, and that wraps up this video. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.